Hi, I'm Lynn Cornell, and welcome to Journey Through the Bible Verse by Verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we study through each book of the Bible, verse by verse and chapter by chapter. Now, I'm using the Holman Christian Standard Bible, so if you're reading from a different Bible translation, the read is different and the message is the same. We're going to continue now studying the Gospel of Mark, and we're in chapter 13. Now, the setting of this chapter, Jesus is going to answer some questions which will be Bible prophecy or the prediction, the end times or eschatology. Now, the setting of this is, remember that this is the last week of Jesus' life. He rode in on Jerusalem on a donkey. He was presenting himself as the Jewish Messiah. Jesus then weeps over the city of Jerusalem. Now, this is important to understand how this, when he begins to speak, why he's saying these things, and how to, in a sense, interpret them and understand some of the things that he's saying here. He weeps over the city, and he says, because you failed to recognize the visitation, my coming, who I am, the statement that God is making through me, the visitation. Because you failed that, he says, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now keep that in mind as we kind of move forward. Now verse 1, he says, as he was going out of the temple complex, one of his disciples said to him, teacher, look, what massive stones, what impressive buildings. And this is referring to the great building project. This is called the Second Temple, or the Temple of Herod. And it began construction. And even at this date, it was sort of still under construction. But it began construction just a little under 20 years before Jesus was born. In fact, at the time of this setting here, the Jews would say that it had been in construction for 46 years. And actually, it won't be completely finished until about 6 years before its destruction. Now, verse 2, Jesus said to them, do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here on another that will not be thrown down. And now, this is a prophecy which came to pass in AD 70. This is also a marker. As we look at prophecy, you can look at when something is fulfilled. We can look at, if it's not fulfilled, what signs to look for. So we know that this came to pass in AD 70 because the Roman general Titus went through and leveled the temple as well as the city of Jerusalem. So this came to pass in AD 70. Now verse 3, while he was sitting on the Mount of Olives across from the temple complex, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to take place? Now, Jesus is going to, so this chapter, he's going to answer these two questions. Verse 5, then Jesus began telling them, watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name saying, I am he, and they will deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, don't be alarmed. These things must take place, but the end is not yet. For nations will rise against nations, and kingdoms against kingdoms, and there will be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are the beginning of birth pains. Now, I always hear people say, when they're looking at the political landscape today, that we're in the last days because of the wars and rumors of wars and so forth and so on. And yes, we are in the end. We're in the end. They are signs of the end time. But notice Jesus says that these are just the beginning of the signs of the end times. They're just the beginning. When we see the different earthquakes and the different seismic things that happen on the earth, weather patterns changing, or they appear to be changing. He said they're just signs of the birth pains, not necessarily the end or the end of the end. Okay. Verse 9, but you be on your guard. They will hand you over to the Sanhedrins, and you will be flogged in the synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings because of me, and as a witness to them. Now, this prophecy, as well as probably most prophecies, refer to the nation of Israel and God's plans and purposes for Israel. So he's not talking about the Christian church here. We will get into other books that we'll be able to put together the Christian church and the Christian movement with end times and prophecy. But just keep in mind, here he's referring to the nation of Israel. Now, how do we know that? Notice what he says right here. They will hand you over to the Sanhedrins. You'll be flogged in the synagogues. Again, so he's talking to the nation of Israel. Now, verse 10. And the good news must first be proclaimed to all the nations. Now, this good news to all the nations. Now, he's not referring geographically here. In other words, during the time of Peter and James, they could have went to every nation on the planet, right? But he's not referring to that. He's referring generationally, meaning this. Go back to God's, in his mind, in whatever that time, we don't know. But man's time on the earth, that is the time, okay, we can say the world. When he refers to the end of the world or the end of the age, he is talking about man's time that God has allotted. So from that time to when God says it is the end, that's what he's referring to. So when he says that the gospel must be preached to all nations generationally from Adam to whenever the end of the world will be. And by the way, to date, even from this prophecy, it's been 2,000 years. Right? So nations have come and gone. Kingdoms have come and gone. So we don't know how longer man's going to be in terms of God's allotted time. But that's when he's referring to when he says that the gospel must be preached to all nations. Verse 11. So when they arrest you and hand you over, don't worry before what you will say. On the contrary, whatever's given you in that hour, say it. For it isn't you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. Now, it's probably hard for us, especially in America, to comprehend what kind of conditions that to bear up under those conditions. When you're being persecuted, when you're being tortured, beaten, and martyred for your faith. What he's saying here is, if you find yourself in that, and there are believers who find themselves, in fact, in every generation since these prophecies were spoken, there have been believers who have suffered persecutions. So God's grace and his spirit will be upon you during that time. And I think, so that's the best way to kind of address that. In other words, I may not ever face that because I live in America and the Constitution protects, me from being persecuted. But if I was to find myself in there, the grace of God and the mercy of God would be upon my life. And then he says, so don't worry about what you say. God will give you what to say. And the purpose of that would be as a witness. Verse 12. Excuse me. Verse 12. Then brother will betray brother to death, and father his child. Children will rise up against his parents and put them to death. And you will be hated by everyone because of my name. But the one who endures to the end will be delivered. And this deliverance is in the context, of course, of your persecution. Not salvation. Okay? Now verse 14. When you see the abomination that caused desolation standing where it shouldn't, let the reader understand. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. A man on a housetop must not come down or go in and get anything out of his house. And a man in the field must not go back to get his clothes. Woe to the pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. Pray it won't happen in the winter. Okay, now here's another prophetic marker. When you see, notice we said that. Now who is he talking to? When you see the abomination that causes desolate standing where it should not. What is this abomination that causes desolation? There's two things. So the quick statement here is the man of sin. He's also known as the Antichrist, but that's really a wrong designation for him. But the Antichrist, or the man of sin, he's also called the beast. And during the tribulation period, there's going to be a time, a 7-year tribulation period, when God is going to judge Israel. He's going to judge the world for their sins. But during that time also, the man of sin will rise to power. And one of the signs is in the middle of this 7-year period of time, he is going to go into the temple. And this is the abomination. He will proclaim that he is God and he will demand to be worshipped. Now, the desolation is when the Jews will refuse that, he will begin a Holocaust against them. And that's why he says the urgency would be so great to flee, to run. And that's what you won't have time to even pack. And that's what he's referring to. But now we know this hasn't happened, by the way. Okay? So, what is interesting as a prophetic marker, we know that the temple has been destroyed. That has come to pass. But this abomination that causes desolation, that hasn't happened. And we're still waiting for that to happen. All right. Verse 19. For those will be days of tribulation, the kind had been from the beginning of the world, which God created until now and never will be. Now, again, during this time, this tribulation period, excuse me, several things is going to be happening. God is going to be judging the earth. I mean, some great things. I mean, horrible things will be happening. Some catastrophic things are going to be happening, as well as, of course, this man of sin, this abomination that makes desolate. He says, so this is known as the Great Tribulation Period. The purpose of this tribulation period it is also called the Day of the Lord. And it is the day where God is pouring out his wrath on the earth. So man's time will end. When we talk about the end of the world, man's time will conclude. Okay? It will conclude with God judging the earth in this great tribulation. And verse 20 says, unless the Lord limit those days, no one would survive. But he limited those days because of the elect whom he has chosen. Now, again, the elect refers to the people of Israel, the Jewish people. That's the elect in this setting. Okay? All right, we're going to pick it up at verse 21 next time. So we'll continue with the chapter then, and I'll see you then.